Hi everyone. So once again, welcome, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone joining us from around the world. Welcome to our first webinar of our interviews series, hosted by the ILPS. If you're on the Zoom call, again, please select, if you haven't already, the language in which you would like to listen in. We've got English, Spanish, and French. I'm Yasmin Ahmed. I'm a member of the ILPS ICC. I'm very humbled and honored to be moderating this webinar with Professor Sison. This has been organized by the ILPS, and I think that most of you are members of the ILPS here on Zoom, so I don't really need to say much about that. We are an anti-imperialist and democratic formation, struggling in all sectors of society against economic, ideological, political, military, and cultural domination and the attacks of imperialism and reaction. And as we're in the midst of this global crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, around the world, countries and cities have been put under lockdowns, and we found ourselves unable to mobilize as we normally would, and have been recalibrating and trying to find a new way in which we can organize under these conditions. So that brings us to virtual organizing and virtual events. And that's why we're here on Zoom and Facebook Live. So welcome to our first in this series, which will be engaging with international events and people's struggles with different revolutionary thinkers, organizers, activists, and we will have more information coming out about this series as time passes. You can find out on the ILPS Solidarity Facebook page. That is where all of these events are going to be live streamed. We also have another series, the Lenin Online series, which you can also find details on the ILPS Solidarity page, as well as ILPS Philippines. So here we are on Zoom, and we're going to be talking today about the international situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the people's response. The format of this webinar is pretty simple. We're going to have a presentation from Professor Sison for 15 minutes, and that will be followed by a questions and answers session. You can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, question and answers button. And if you press on that, you can enter in the questions that come up during the talk, and then we will get around to those in the session. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please comment on the stream with your question and use the hashtag AskJoma to get your questions in. And before I pass over to Professor Sison, I am going to just give a short introduction, because we probably don't need much of an introduction to Professor Sison. He is the Chairman Emeritus of the ILPS. The professor is a writer, an educator, an activist, and a longtime struggler for people's liberation. He's the co-founder of Kabataan Makabayan in 1964, the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines in 1969, and amongst the founders of the ILPS in 2001. Professor Sison has vast contributions to people's struggles. He has been a political prisoner in the Philippines and the Netherlands, and he has an extensive collection of political writings as well as books of poetry. And I think we're all very much looking forward to hearing his words on what we're facing today, because all of us are affected by this pandemic and this crisis, and international solidarity is what this is about. And yes, without further ado, let me hand you over to Professor Sison. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Warmest greetings to all our participants, our dear colleagues and friends. I'm highly honored and delighted to be the first speaker in the series of webinars billed as teach-ins or interviews, online discussions on international events and people's struggles under the auspices of ILPS Solidarity. The format is simple. I make the presentation and the audience can react with observations, questions, and further discussions. My task today is to present the international situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the people's response. Let me state at the outset that the world capitalist system was already in trouble even before the COVID-19 pandemic arose. And the pandemic has unmasked and aggravated the crisis of global capitalism. It is of urgent importance to know how the people are affected and how they are responding. Science has advanced so fast and so far and has provided the technology to raise the productivity of the forces and means of production to such a high degree as to have the capability of eliminating class exploitation, gross inequality, and mass poverty, and providing a comfortable and fruitful life for at least twice the population of the world today. The social character of production has risen so high with the adoption of higher technology, but unfortunately the monopoly bourgeoisie and its financial oligarchy own the means of production, control the relations of production, and dictate the terms of employment and the use of the human and material resources for the maximization of private profit and the inflation of the value of private assets. Abusing bourgeois state power over the toiling masses of workers and peasants and middle social strata, the international bourgeoisie has adopted the neoliberal economic policy in order to accelerate the accumulation and concentration of productive and financial capital in the hands of the few, the mere 1% of the population, to exploit, deprive, and oppress the 99%. The neoliberal economic policy has liberalized trade and investments, provided tax cuts, incentives, and bailouts to the monopoly bourgeoisie, pressed down wages and other incomes of the lower classes, privatized public assets, reduced social services, imposed austerity measures, removed social and environmental regulations, and denationalized the less developed economies of the world. The crisis of overproduction has therefore become more frequent and worse every time. The working people have suffered disemployment at so rapid a rate and cannot buy what is produced by the economy. The so-called middle class has dwindled and joined the ranks of the proletariat. Yet, the monopoly bourgeoisie has proceeded to make the people suffer and insist on a system of unbridled greed. Before the financial crisis of 2008 can be solved, another more serious crisis has come on top of it to further prolong and deepen the stagnation and depression of the global economy. All imperialist countries suffer from the crisis of overproduction due to the dwindling incomes of the working people in the underdeveloped countries. All major contradictions in the world are intensifying. Those between capital and labor in the imperialist countries, those among the imperialist powers, those between the imperialist powers and the oppressed peoples and nations, and those between the imperialist powers and a number of states assertive of their national independence and socialist aspirations. I mentioned the first contradiction between capital and the imperialist countries to to stress the point that even in their own national bulwarks of monopoly capitalism, the imperialist powers have gone so far in exploiting the working class and diminishing the middle class as they have engaged in one round of austerity measures and another to cope with economic and financial crisis. US imperialism has complemented the neoliberal policy to maximize profits from the production process and financial markets with the neoconservative policy to ensure government expenditures for the acquisition of weapons from the military-industrial complex, for the maintenance of more than 800 overseas military bases, and for endless wars of aggression, including proxy wars and military intervention in support of local reactionary regimes. After China became monopoly capitalist in 1976, it used to be touted as the main partner of the US in neoliberal globalization and as the exemplar of continuous capitalist growth. But since 2015, it has become conspicuously afflicted with unsustainable national, corporate, and household debts, and the same economic and financial crisis that bedevil the traditional imperialist powers headed by the US. The inter-imperialist contradictions are sharpening fast, with China having become the main rival of US imperialism. The US regrets and seeks to overcome the consequences of its previous concessions to China in terms of investments, trade, and technology transfers. It is resentful that China has used state planning and state-owned enterprises in order to achieve strategic economic and military goals. But of course, China has its own vulnerabilities, like having to deal with the trade war already started by the US and with the mountains of debt it has accumulated, to cite only a few major problems. The US is trying hard to cut the large export surpluses that China gains in trade with the US and reduce the amount of surplus capital that China uses to expand its own fields of investments, markets, and sources of raw materials in various countries. The US and China tried to strengthen their respective positions by alliances with other countries. The US still has the main influence in the UN and controls the multilateral agencies, the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, and the NATO and other military alliances. China has its all-round alliance with Russia and has tried to broaden this alliance with BRICS, SCO, the BRICS Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund, and the Belt and Road Initiative. The imperialist countries continue to shift the burden of crisis to their reactionary client states in the underdeveloped countries and therefore exacerbate the imperialist contradictions with the oppressed peoples and nations. They are detested for aggravating the underdevelopment of entire countries and continents in contrast with the false promises of development. Such states are always and increasingly in an untenable position. They suffer from widening deficits in trade and balance of payments because their exports consist of raw materials and semi-manufactures. They are mounting difficulties in servicing previous foreign debts and getting new foreign loans to be able to get by. The broad masses of the people detest imperialists and their puppets for the state terrorism that they suffer. The conditions are increasingly becoming favorable for the rise of various anti-imperialist and democratic struggles. There are a number of countries where the revolutionary parties of the proletariat and the people persevere in armed revolution for national and social liberation. These serve as example to all the oppressed peoples and nations in the world. There are states of underdeveloped countries that are assertive of national independence and socialist aspirations. These include the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. They are dramatically standing up against US imperialism, which is using economic sanctions, military blockades, and threats of aggression. Certain countries in Southeast Asia are also standing up to both the US and China. Vietnam is outstanding in opposing the invalid claim of China over 90% of the South China Sea. It is in this part of the world where China is exposing itself as an aggressive violator of the sovereign rights of other countries in violation of international law and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. But US imperialism still has the worst standing as the aggressor and violator of sovereign rights in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but it is paying dearly for its wars of aggression and military intervention. It is on a course of accelerated strategic decline in an increasingly multipolar world in which the inter-imperialist contradictions which incite the proletarian people of the world to rise up. Since last year, there has been an outburst of mass protest all over the world in both underdeveloped and developed countries. This is a clear manifestation of the people's resistance to all the evil workings of imperialism, such as neoliberal exploitation, the rise of state terrorism, fascism, austerity measures, racism, gender discrimination, and imperialist plunder and destruction of the environment. We are now in the midst of the transition to the global resurgence of the anti-imperialist and democratic struggles for national liberation, democracy, and socialism. Between the two main imperialist powers, the US and China, there are accusations, counter-accusations regarding the origin of COVID-19 and the criminal motive behind it. There are speculations that one imperialist power is using the COVID-19 pandemic in order to weaken and defeat the other. These are manifestations of the growing contradictions between the US and China. China accused the US of having created COVID-19 in a biowarfare laboratory in Fort Detrick in Maryland, USA, and having used the US athletic delegation to the World Military Games in Wuhan in October 2019 to bring into Wuhan the highly contagious virus. In turn, the US accuses China of having created the virus in its virological institute only to leak it to the Wuhan wet market through the sale of laboratory test animals. There is a third view that the Chinese scientists themselves got the virus from a laboratory operated by the US military and somehow leaked the virus to the Wuhan meat market. Still, there is a fourth view that COVID-19 is of purely zoonotic origin and has mutated from a previous virus generated by an environment extremely devastated and imbalanced by imperialist plunder. We let the independent scientists do their investigation and let the experts on international criminal law use the scientific findings and conclusions to prosecute the culprit if possible. But in the meantime, we can discuss the impact and consequences of COVID-19 to the world capitalist system and to the people. COVID-19 has exposed and aggravated the antisocial character of the world capitalist system, the unpreparedness of the monopoly bourgeoisie, and the harsh consequences to the people who have long suffered class exploitation, gross inequality, mass poverty, and deprivation of social services in the fields of public health, education, and housing. Under neoliberal economic policy, the broad masses of the people have become extensively and extremely vulnerable to the recurrent and worsening crisis of the world capitalist system, to the imperialist sanctions, threats of war, actual wars of counter-revolution and aggression, natural disasters, and pandemics. The vulnerability of the overwhelming majority of the people consists of having no income and property to tide them over in case of unemployment or being out of work, even only for a week or for whatever reason of emergency. This is absolutely clear in a lockdown situation in which the people cannot go to work and have no public transport to use in order to obtain medical treatment for COVID-19 or any other illness. Worst of all, when so many people need testing and treatment in time of a pandemic, the public health system has been eroded by the neoliberal economic policy of privatizing and eroding what remains of the public health system, so that there are not enough health personnel, facilities, equipment, and medicines. The remaining tokens of the public health system are easily overloaded and break down, and the private hospitals can at will turn away patients because they are not intended to serve the public. There have been inadequate facilities, or the patients cannot pay for the medical treatment. We have also seen the tragedy of doctors, nurses, and other health workers themselves getting sick and dying from COVID-19 because of the lack of personal protection equipment. The neoliberal state and the hospitals have appreciated the role of private profit, but have depreciated the role of the health workers and the social service that they must render to the people. In quite a number of developed and underdeveloped countries where neoliberalism has been imposed as a policy, there has been the pseudo-scientific notion that it is enough to do washing of the hands and social distancing and at worst lockdown on communities or entire regions, because after the contagion has run rampant and claimed plenty of victims, then the herd immunity develops in the rest of the population. Thus, quite a number of governments have not made timely and adequate preparations and action plans to fight the pandemic. There is no mass testing for a long while. Thus, the spread of the contagion has not been measured well, and there is a lack of or shortage of health personnel and resources for the treatment of those afflicted by COVID-19. The lack or shortage of ventilators has caused the death of many patients suffering from pneumonia, whether they are elderly or younger. The ruling bourgeoisie and the entire ruling system have deprived the overwhelming majority of the people of the means of fending for themselves in time of lockdowns, and their political agents can only promise food rations and some compensation for the wages lost. But the promise is not kept in a timely and sufficient manner. The most victimized are those who are the millions of jobless and homeless, as well as those imprisoned in congested jails. But ahead of any reasonable concession to the people, the monopoly bourgeoisie is assured of financial bailouts and stimulus packages in order to make up for their business losses. We are well aware of the policies and actions being undertaken by the rulers of imperialist countries to override the breakdown of the production chain and the drastic falls in the stock market. In the underdeveloped countries, especially where the barefaced repressive regimes exist, the tyrannical and corrupt bureaucrats invoke the COVID-10 to divert public funds to their own pockets instead of providing for the urgent needs of the people. Whatever is good or service is provided is ascribed to those in power in order to raise their political stock. Worst of all, the fascist-minded rulers use the lockdowns to tighten their command over the military and police forces of the state to promote further the notion through the exercise of repressive measures that they are the saviors of the people. In the meantime, they use state power to aggrandize the private interests of their families, political cohorts, and business cronies. It is correct for the people to use disinfectants, do social distancing, and respect the rules of quarantine and lockdown whenever these are needed in the face of COVID-19. The people must stay safe from the highly contagious virus and avoid prejudicing the health of other people, but they retain their democratic rights to make demands from the state and health authorities, mass testing of the people at the community level, and treatment for the sick and the means of survival where they are locked down and deprived of the means of livelihood. They can ventilate their grievances in order to obtain positive results for the common good. To any positive extent that public officials recognize the urgent needs of the people and try to satisfy them, it is absolutely clear that social needs are being met by policies and actions for the common good and for whoever is in dire need. But it is clear from the beginning that capitalism fails in the face of pandemic. What is needed is a spirit of service of the people and the desire for socialism. In view of the utter bankruptcy and antisocial character of capitalism in time of pandemic, the people and their anti-imperialist and democratic forces are justly demanding system change from capitalism to socialism, and that everyone must be assured of a basic income in order to subsist, and the social services like public health, public education, and public housing. Higher economic and social demands can be made in the developed countries, especially the imperialist countries. The level of economic development allows substantial social reforms and even socialism, but of course the obstacle is the violence-prone rapacity of the monopoly bourgeoisie, which would rather repress the people or aggress other countries than agree readily to the just economic and social demands of the people. Consider the trillions of dollars wasted by the US on its high-tech armaments, overseas military bases, and endless wars of aggression. The US military forces have been far worse than COVID-19 in killing people. They have killed 25 to 30 million people since the end of World War II. The huge US military expenditures can be redirected towards expansion and improvement of social services. Best of all, if the American people succeed at system change, they can build a socialist society of plenty, creativity, and justice and peace. If the monopoly bourgeoisie cease to engage in domestic oppression and exploitation and in wars of aggression and mass destruction abroad. In the case of underdeveloped, especially pre-industrial countries, the tax levied on exploiting classes can be increased instead of decreased in order to promote economic development through national industrialization and land reform and provide social services in the spheres of education, health, housing, and so on. But substantial reforms can be achieved only if the people have strong patriotic and progressive forces in order to remove from power those who harm the people and promote those leaders that work for the benefit of the people. Best of all, the people and their revolutionary forces can strive for system change and achieve national and social liberation towards the goal of socialism. In any kind of crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the best of the people and their organized forces stand out and shine. The people's social activists make the demands in favor of the people and do what they can to arouse, organize, and mobilize them for the common good. They gain the experience and strength for carrying out anti-imperialist and democratic struggle toward the goal of socialism. At the community level, they create ways for the people to have food, shelter, and medical care, and to engage in mutual aid. They call for donations for those who can give these, and they do not get paid for the volunteer work that they render. The actions that they carry out for the common good under the circumstances of fighting the pandemic are a means of gaining public support and strengthening the organized forces. In certain countries where the people have revolutionary movements against the ruling system, the leading revolutionary parties have responded to the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire in order to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. In these countries, the revolutionary movement have their organizations attending to the economic and health needs of the people. As a result of the pandemic, the vile character and failings of the world capitalist system are exposed. Even after the pandemic, the systemic crisis will continue and worsen in both imperialist and in non-imperialist countries. And the anti-people regimes and leaders in many countries will be held accountable and hated as enemies of the people, not only for mishandling and aggravating the pandemic, but for continuing an unjust system. But wherever they exist, the revolutionary movements of the people will grow further in strength and will make advances. Where they do not exist, they will rise and wage revolutionary struggles. The world capitalist system will continue to be crisis-stricken economically and politically, and its crimes will generate more favorable conditions for the rise of the revolutionary movement for national liberation, democracy, and socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sison, for that very enlightening paper. We're now going to be moving on to the questions and answer session. I'd like to remind everyone joining that there is the option to put a question in through our Q&A, which will be a button that you can find on the bottom of the screen. The people who are listening on Facebook, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if you want to ask a question, please put it in the comments on the stream with the hashtag AskJoma. Now I've got the first question that has come in from Canada, I believe. I will send this also to you, Professor, so that you can read it, because it's quite long. So, it is, here's the question, there's a bit of context. It is said that by 2027, China will overtake the US as having the biggest economy. Some people are saying that if the 20th century was the American century, the 21st will be the Chinese century. If indeed this will happen, do you think that there will be some change in international relations? For instance, will there be more respect for international law and for sovereignty of countries? If so, will this be a positive thing for the people's revolutionary and progressive struggles? For instance, countries like DPRK, Cuba, Vietnam, Venezuela would profit from such a situation where the US will no longer have such a free hand in bullying these countries that you would describe as having effective governments that assert national independence and the socialist cause. I will also put that question in writing to you so you can read it. As that question is quite a long one, and you might have to have some, we've just also gotten one in on Facebook, which is kind of relating to your first few paragraphs on the COVID situation. And it asks, what's the real score, a viral conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 was a deliberate plan of China to, in quotes, dominate the world? Professor, can you hear me?
Can you repeat the question? Hello?
The question is, was how, relating to the first few paragraphs of your speech on the COVID-19, and if the conspiracies around China having it as a deliberate plan. What is your take on that, Professor Sison?
Yung sa conspiracies daw on China, what is your take on that?
Well, the United States has long been known for developing weapons of mass destruction, of course, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, remember Agent Orange, and of course, there are many US military laboratories engaged in bio warfare research. And I'm inclined to believe that the source is the US. And the first place for using the virus would be China. But then, so far, the evidence being presented is quite circumstantial. There must be some more clinching evidence. Of course, there is the assertion that only the US has the complete genome tree from which COVID-19 could be derived. So that's a strong point against the US. And there are other circumstances which indicate that the US is the main culprit. But I would rather let the scientists, especially the independent ones, to make the most solid findings and conclusions. And on that basis, experts in international criminal law as well as political activists can move in order to condemn the culprit. So in the position paper of ILPS issued, it was pointed out that because of the environmental destruction and degradation made by well, imperialist corporations, then you have nature getting back at the people for the offenses made by the multinational corporations that are abusing the environment. That is also a possibility. You know, it's quite difficult to say whether the virus is completely zoonotic in origin, because you know you can get something from nature, from the genome tree. You can get a virus that had already appeared, no? But you know you cannot get away from using live animals to test how effective the virus is. No? So before a laboratory-made virus is released to harm people, they are first tested on animals. So there's no getting away from the zoonotic trail. So I think this, I would leave it to the scientists. I would rather consider the facts and terms that I can easily take into account as a political scientist. I'm not leaving the door for further investigation. At the same time, I would indicate the clues, such as those already provided by the biowarfare laboratories of the US. You know, there are quite a number of them, not just in Fort Detrick,
Yes.
but in many places in the US as well as abroad. The US maintains biowarfare laboratories.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a lot of, I think the US is probably one of the biggest culprits of biowarfare. But there are quite some questions coming in for you, Professor. So perhaps we can move on to the next question. I want to ask Aldo, if you can please repeat the question so that our Facebook Live viewers can also hear, if you repeat it so that Professor Sison's mic will pick up the question. Okay, the next question is from there's quite a few. Let me select which one. Okay. So this one came in from Facebook. And it says that there are valid fears that the global economy will suffer a recession due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Provided the more intense neoliberal policies on the world economy, do you think the corresponding global recession would be more than or equal to the 2008 global financial crisis?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, Aldo, can you hear me too?
Yeah. But it's not so clear also.
Okay, yeah. So the question is asking about the expected global recession that will correspond to this global pandemic.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And a comparison to the 2008 global financial crisis.
You know, my thesis is that the workings of monopoly capitalism is such that you have problems, and then the usual the workings of capitalism before neoliberalism have been at work, and then as neoliberalism has been adopted and used by the imperialists. So you have a more rapid recurrence and ever worsening recurrence of the crisis of overproduction. And, you know, the cure that is used, you know, the financial bailouts and stimulus packages used to favor the monopoly bourgeoisie actually aggravate the problem, especially the social problems, while the monopoly bourgeoisie, together with this financial oligarchy, benefits even from the crisis. The people suffer the most. Workers suffer from the stagnation and depression, the unemployment that the further unemployment that results, and you know, you have the homelessness and so on. So now here comes pandemic. Here comes the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly, so many people need to be tested in order to know how the pandemic is running, who are the people who should be looked after, who should be treated, no? And then the personnel, the facilities and other means are not there. So there is a complete exposure of how antisocial the capitalist system is. It's not prepared for this emergency. And of course, it's a distinct question that in the first place, the imperialists in their competition, you know, use biowarfare. But I think you set that aside, pending more investigation and more findings and conclusions that would satisfy us. It's bad enough that the system is incapable of attending to the problems of people getting that need to be tested, that need to be treated, and that have to be given at least a subsistence, the means of survival in times of lockdowns. So I might say that COVID-19 has performed the functions of unmasking or exposing how antisocial the system is, and it contributes to the aggravation of the crisis of the world capitalist system. Because, you know, when lockdowns occur, there is a breakdown of production. There is a reduction of production, and that aggravates the already running tendency of the economy to stagnate. And the conditions of depression, they actually exist, and they become worse.
Thank you
So, yes.
For that answer. Moving on from that question, also related to the expected recession because of this crisis. And Professor Sison, I want to ask if you can say the question that you're answering so that the viewers on Facebook will know, because they cannot hear what I am saying. So if you can say the question that you are answering before giving us your answer.
Yeah, I think recession, the Great Recession.
Sorry, I haven't finished the actual question. One moment. So there is a question about the what will happen given that that China has gained considerable economic power, and in the post-COVID-19 phase, we will probably be in a global recession. So the question is, will the US and the EU go toward bilateral, or will they still pursue a multilateral trade system in the post-COVID-19 system?
I think the US will continue to tend towards protectionism.
I-repeat mo daw muna yung question. I-repeat mo yung question para marinig na live.
I will repeat.
Repeat the question.
Yeah. Will the US continue with its, avowal of neoliberal globalization and the need for multilaterality in trade and so on? And, there's the notion that under neoliberalization, everybody produces what it can best produce and bring to the market, and everyone would become prosperous. But in fact, under neoliberalism, the game is enlarging your GDP. Whether your GDP is the result of borrowing or producing some low-grade product, low value-added product, or some highly valued. You see, the United States thought it could have a division of labor or production with China. The US would concentrate on the big items, producing planes, tanks, and so on. And then China would be conceded consumer manufacturing. But the US, in trying to win an ideological war against socialism, actually created its own monster. And by conceding to China manufacturing, consumer manufacturing, even of the low-tech level in the 1980s, that served already to undermine the US economy, because consumer manufacturing employs a lot of people in the US. You outsource that, and you undermine the condition of employment. You increase the number of unemployed. And then when China had this Tiananmen problem, uprising so many cities, the US agreed to give more concessions to China. It became loose in putting in all sorts of investments by which certain technology would have to be brought to China. And then China was using a two-tiered economy. It had turned capitalism, but like Hitler, using state planning and mastering the resources, public resources, under the shocked policy of under the economist of Hitler. You can use state monopoly capitalism to complement private monopoly capitalism. That's what China did, so that it could achieve strategic economic goals as well as strategic security or military goals. And after some time, it so happened in the time of Trump, the US realized that China sort of took advantage, had taken advantage of the concessions given to China. So, the main instigator of neoliberalism, the US, has turned practically protectionist. It says it has dropped its advocacy of neoliberalism because it wants to make America great again by taking measures to cut down what has emerged as its main rival. So that's the situation between China and US. So there is economic competition and political rivalry going on. China is quite ambitious. It wants to reverse what the West colonial powers, the Western colonial powers, have begun in the 16th century. The trade, based on the oceans, no? The maritime trade. It now wants to use the land-based trade in the Asia, Eurasia, and on its flanks. So you have this Belt and Road Initiative, which is mainly using roads and rails. No?
Yeah. I think we should get on to the next question as we are running short on time and we still have quite a lot of questions coming in. Thank you, Professor, for that answer. This question is from Orly in the Philippines, and they ask if, because of the situation in the Philippines, where the lockdown is a very militaristic one with no health response for the people, they ask, is it necessary to call for the lifting of such a lockdown? That previously that it was that quarantines and lockdowns were measures for the people's health, but due to the situation in the Philippines, beyond calling for economic aid, mass testing, and respect for human rights amid the state's lockdown, should they also, how can they challenge the lockdown itself?
Can you say that again? How?
You are asking a question about the relation of the Philippines to the competition between the US and China?
No, no. My question is what beyond when in regards to the people's response in the Philippines, where the people are under a militaristic lockdown with very little for people's health, how can they go about challenging the lockdown itself beyond calling for economic aid, mass testing, and respect for human rights?
The question is, with the ongoing military lockdown, how can the Filipino people respond to the challenge? With the ongoing military lockdown?
Yes, the military lockdown is a show of fascist power by the Duterte regime. In the first place, Duterte has been responsible for allowing the casino tourists and the casino employers to come freely to the Philippines, even after it was already discovered that some of the tourists were sick with COVID-19. No, but he would allow the entry of the COVID carriers and those sick with COVID, and then his simpleton reason was that the country had to earn money from tourism, from the casino gambling. When he adopted the lockdown measure, he did not make sure that there would be testing. There was a lack of preparations for mass testing. So, the figures about those afflicted with COVID are very unreliable because there has been no mass testing. And then just to test, you need a lot of things like the personal protection gear for the health workers. And then, of course, you must have hospital space for those who are already found sick with COVID-19. So Duterte has only been interested in making a show of force, tightening his control, his personal control over the military and police, and maintaining mass intimidation in connection with his desire for realizing fully his ambition of imposing fascist dictatorship on the Philippines, he did not make any preparations. Even after he got money amounting to 275 million pesos from Congress, he did not use those funds for the declared purpose of attending to the economic and health needs of the people. And you know, when the lockdown was applied, you know, people could not go to their work. There were no public transport, and repressive measures were taken against those who would go out without the hard-to-get passes from the local officials. So, but there was no plan, no system by which to take care of those who cannot earn, especially people who belong to what you might call the informal sector of the economy, those who engage in odd jobs. And then, of course, there are the people who are jobless and homeless, there's the problem of putting them in the proper places so that they would be able to survive and do not get sick and do not spread the contagion. So there has been a full month of the lockdown, but still no testing, no proper care for the sick, and no means of survival, no food rations provided. And as promised by the regime. So the Duterte has come to the point of saying, he has moved from a point of absurdity to another. He said he has all the money to solve the problem. But then without using the money for the good of the people, people now wonder, where did the money go? He now says he has to borrow money or sell the country in order to get the money. He, you know, keeps on mentioning certain parts of the country to sell. You have a very backward type of despot. No, the important thing for him is to be able to show power, intimidate people, and keep himself in power. So that is one thing that emanates from the problem of COVID-19. People suffer, and then the same politicians who had taken advantage of the people and who love to keep the power to be able to exploit the people, take advantage of the situation. But at the same time, the people are enraged, are outraged, and they're angry. And at the moment, they have some dual concern, you know, to respect the quarantine because of the argument that that's the way how to fight COVID-19. But people are now eager to use all possible means, even as people are kept confined in their own homes. They are now trying to adopt ways of resistance, such as the noise barrage, using the social media, using the internet, and so on and so forth. And they are preparing to undertake mass actions to oust Duterte as soon as it is possible to mass people on the streets. And of course, on the side of the, as far as the Philippines is concerned, the most powerful kind of resistance can come from the countryside. You know, in every region in the Philippines, well, in all the regions, all over the country, I would say, there are 110 guerrilla fronts. If every one of the guerrilla front will launch offensives against the regime, that can even overthrow the ruling system in a matter of a few months or a few years. So it's possible for, the Philippines consists of an archipelago, but in every major island, and even the small islands, there are already units of the People's Army. So the only thing needed is a good conductor who orchestrates the units of the new People's Army all over the Philippines. What is needed is simple orchestration. And what is good about COVID-19 is that it has exposed how weak the regime is. The regime will become even more politically, economically, and financially weak after COVID-19. So, the Philippines relies on incomes. Okay.
Yes, I think you could go on and on, Professor, but we do have a lot of questions. I think we probably just have time for one more right now. I'm going to read a comment that's here in the question and answers on the Zoom call. It says, Russian and Chinese revolution were achieved at the time of 2 world wars when there was the highest states of imperialist contradictions. Now, we are seeing a high level of economic and political contradiction. People have a high level of frustration against neoliberalism and a great hope for socialism at this time of COVID-19, once again after economic recession of 2008. I think we, the socialist and democratic forces, must try to capitalize the situation for revolution in our countries and at the global level. So I request Comrade Sison to try and theorize it from your level so that it will take a global attention and help the global revolutionary process. That was a comment from Comrade Nahendra in Nepal. And yes, I think it would be great if you could do more writing on this situation. And we have a lot of more questions that comrades have sent in from around the world. So perhaps we can do another seminar in this. I guess we can end with, there's a lot of questions here, and I want to let you answer one more question. So I'm going to just pick up this one from Jenny. And that is about the, what are your thoughts about the truce between the US and China in battling the COVID-19?
Can you say that again?
Yes.
Can
just
you say
one
that
moment.
Again, Yasmin?
Let me just pull it up again. And I'm sorry. I'm actually going to ask a different question that would be a bit better to end this session with. Professor, you've just described how much this pandemic has revealed about the system that we are living in, and so we're interested to know, what will the global economy be like after COVID-19? And yes, that is our last question. And if you can just repeat what will the global economy look like after the pandemic?
Then, of course, the crisis will become worse. COVID-19 is an aggravating factor. The world capitalist system was already on a trajectory of worsening and deepening crisis. Now, added to the factors, previous factors at work. You have the impact and the consequences of COVID-19. And so the various countries will scramble, especially the imperialist countries, because they are the main suppliers of things that are manufactured on top of, agricultural and raw materials from the underdeveloped countries. They have the capacity to scramble to revive production. Some people have observed that COVID, the breakdown of production caused by COVID is a sort of provides, in a way, respite for the crisis of production. But you see, the crisis of production is mainly about people who have been previously thrown out of jobs. There will be a scramble at first. There will be a drag before the imperialist countries can revive production. But their tendency will be to overproduce what people cannot buy, because people are out of jobs. Corporations will use the occasion to take advantage of the workers, either throw them out of work or press down the wages. And so there will be the tendency for the contradictions of labor and capital to worsen, and also the contradictions among imperialist powers will sharpen. As you know, they cannot adjust they cannot orchestrate in such a way that they do not collide against each other in producing things. And the tendency will always be to overproduce goods that cannot be sold in the market. They undermine their own market because they have been pressing down the incomes of the working people, and they have even diminished the middle class. And so the middle class now, quite a number of them have been thrown out of jobs, so they are simply put in the position of what is called a precariat. No, so I think worse times are coming as a result of the combination of the tendency of global capitalism to deteriorate and get into deeper crisis. Now you have this COVID-19 as a sort of an incendiary. You might say COVID-19 can work to some extent like somebody burning the theater when the theater puts stages lousy programs, and people don't buy the tickets anymore. So, but somebody lights up and then burns the whole theater. So, but that's only in a metaphorical way of speaking. To some extent, COVID-19 can make the situation worse for capitalism. Because, victims of capitalism become active. As a result of being more victimized, they will rise up, and that will become part of the political crisis. The exploiters, the oppressors and exploiters like imperialist powers can compete and rival each other politically. But when the working people, the exploited and working people assert their own rights against the exploiters, socialist countries have emerged in history in the 20th century. They emerged in the 20th century with imperialist powers at war with each other. They generate the conditions for the proletariat and the rest of the people to rise up. So there, a situation like that may be developing in which the inter-imperialist contradictions create the conditions for revolutionary civil wars.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Sison, for this very interesting webinar, the first of a series of interviews, an ILPS series. We will have more information on the upcoming events as the week goes on. I also want to mention that there will also be an online webinar by the ILPS Philippines that is called Lenin Online. They have events on April 18th and April 22nd. And additionally, I want to ask everyone who is joining us here to take part in the ILPS Global Day of Action for People's Health on April the 15th. So that will be a lot of online mobilizations and actions, and if it is possible for you in your location to do something, to do an in-person action, we encourage that. And I think we have seen some fantastic examples of how creative you can be with your online campaigns. Last week with the Aus Duterte campaign that was happening, I was very inspired with the creativity that I saw online. So I implore all of us to see what we can do. There is information about the Day of Action on our website, ilps.info. And once again, I would like to thank everyone for joining on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Thank you for all the questions that came in. We did not get around to answering all of them, but we are hoping we will have more of these sessions, and we have all of your questions recorded and we can send them to Professor Sison, so hopefully he can answer them for you either on a webinar or in writing. I think that is about everything that I have to say for now. I'm looking forward to connecting with more of you. It will be the same time, Thursday, 9 p.m. Manila time, 3 p.m. Central European time, and 9 a.m. I believe Eastern Standard Time, every Thursday. With that said, thank you very much again, Professor Germa. Thank you, Aldo and Malcolm and Lisa and the team, the General Secretariat team, and everyone who asked questions and participated. And yes, long live international solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.